Good afternoon. Can you believe it? We're almost to the end of this festival. It's been a great time. I hope you've had as good a time as we all have. And after 4 days of books and writers filling our beautiful city with glorious words and ideas, now we have to close. But there is next year. This year's festival has been a wonderful whirlwind. Thank you so much for staying with us from Thursday until now. Special thanks once again go out to our good friends at Georgia Power, David and Nancy Cintron, the Sheehan Family Foundation, Mark and Pat Sewin, and Philippi and Nancy B. Beekman Foundation, our presenting sponsors for this year's festival. Plus, today's event would not have been possible without the generosity of Bob Faircloth. Thank you, Bob. As you know by now, my name is Bo Anders, and I'm the president of the festival's board of directors. And on behalf of our board members and the 250 volunteers, which you saw yesterday, who help make the festival a reality every year, I'm overjoyed that you're here again this afternoon to see our amazing authors from Indianapolis, Lynn Vincent and Sara Vladic. Thank you for enthusiastically supporting the festival's mission, encouraging and celebrating the written word. The festival is fortunate again to have special volunteers helping this afternoon, book lovers just like you. They're serving as your ushers upstairs and down. The Landings Bookies, Savannah Newcomers, Landings Men Book Club. Please give them a round of applause. And as I've mentioned before, the 33 authors who came early and went out to schools with our volunteers. That is such a great thing to do, and I encourage anybody who's interested to get involved in that because it's a lot of fun. Also, I just came from the opening of the first SBF Children's Book Tent. They're rocking and rolling out there with a fiddler right now, and authors and artists, and it's going to be fun. They have 5 amazing authors sharing the love of reading with the children of Savannah. It's an important part of the literacy efforts that we look to every year in the book festival. And we're thrilled to co-sponsor this event with the Live Oak Public Libraries and the foundation, the Library Foundation. Before we get started, I just want to pause and thank someone who is a huge part of our family. Would Mark Murphy please come up? And is Mark around? And Daphne, if you could come up, if you can negotiate the stairs, come on up here too. They're a team and have both been an integral part. Will you help her? Mark served as the SBF president for 2 years, is now serving as our past president. He has championed the SBF cause with energy and enthusiasm over the years, and we truly appreciate his support and engagement. On behalf of the board, here's a gift certificate for the Gray. We hope Daphne and you will enjoy a lovely evening together.
Thank you.
And I forgot to mention, go down. I forgot to mention Daphne has also been an integral part of the efforts in the office over the years. I'm going to say this again. I've said it many times. Remember your tickets from Friday night. Keep a hold of them because Daniel Krauthammer is coming on the 11th of March at 6 here in the theater. Turn off your phones. No flash photography. And for the Q&A period, remember, one question. No stories. And immediately following, Lynn Vincent and Sara Vladic will be signing copies right down here. A numbered signing card provided by our booksellers from Ex Libris should accompany and will secure your place in line. It's now my pleasure to introduce a friend, Ed Conant. Ed is a retired naval officer who spent years serving on submarines operating in the Pacific. Following Navy retirement, Ed worked in the submarine defense industry for 2 decades. He's an avid reader of World War II history and very enthusiastic about the Indianapolis. Please welcome Ed Conant.
Thank you, Bo. Good afternoon, everybody. As president of the board of the Savannah Book Festival, Bo gets to thank many people, but we haven't had an opportunity to thank him. I propose a round of applause for his leadership in putting on this great festival. The story of the Navy heavy cruiser Indianapolis is about the sailors who made the ultimate sacrifice. It's also about the incredible fight for survival of those who successfully abandoned ship and then spent 4 to 5 days adrift in the Pacific. The Indianapolis suffered the worst casualties in the Navy history for a ship at sea. Many books have chronicled the various battles of World War II, battles filled with courageous acts and of great loss. The book you will hear about today is the definitive and riveting account of the loss of Indianapolis. It also addresses the dramatic events after the war when the Navy attempted to deal with the accountability for that loss. For those who have read the book, as a Pacific Fleet submarine officer, I can tell you that if the Indianapolis had zigzagged, it wouldn't have stopped the Japanese deadly attack on their submarine. Lynn Vincent and Sara Vladic formed an unsurpassed team to give us this epic story. Lynn served in the U.S. Navy during the Gulf War and is a #1 New York Times best-selling author and co-author of 11 nonfiction books with more than 16 million copies in print, including Same Kind of Different as Me and Heaven is for Real. A veteran journalist and author of more than 1,000 articles, her investigative pieces have been cited in the U.S. Congress and the U.S. Supreme Court. Sara Vladic is an award-winning documentary filmmaker and one of the world's leading experts on the USS Indianapolis. She became obsessed with the story at the age of 13. Over the next 2 decades, Sara met and interviewed 108 of the ship's survivors, and in 2016, she released an award-winning and emotional documentary film, USS Indianapolis, The Legacy. She's published new research on Indianapolis that's been printed in the U.S. Naval Institute proceedings. She's also appeared as an expert commentator on PBS's USS Indianapolis, Live from the Deep, which explored the ship's wreckage. Indianapolis is another testament to the sacrifice of the greatest generation, to whom America owes so much. Ladies and gentlemen, it is my privilege to introduce the authors of Indianapolis, Lynn Vincent and Sara Vladic.
I started into the Navy when I was 16, and I saw all 10 battles.
I saw the flag raised out in Sara Vladic.
I personally helped load and unload components of the atomic bomb.
On the 30th of July, we were hit by 2 torpedoes from a submarine and sunk.
Next thing I know, the ship's going right out from under me.
I never did know how to swim, and the Navy never taught me how to swim.
And here's all these sharks going around. Come right across your legs like that.
It was chaos.
We couldn't understand why we weren't rescued.
A lot of them lost the will to live.
Us guys decided, well, hell, this is where we're going to die.
Then there on that 4th day, I said, I hear a plane. And we began to splash water, we began to yell, we began to pray, everything. And seemingly when he got to a point that had he gone any further, he would have gone over, but you know what he did? He made a dive.
How did I make it with nothing to eat, no water to drink, no sleep for 5 nights? Tell them the Lord was with me.
If somebody wrote this up as fiction, nobody would believe it happened.
People don't realize the politics in the armed forces.
All the headlines were about the captain being court-martialed.
Many a head should have rolled before they ever got to the captain.
It's the story that's not been told. Those don't want to remember, they don't want to recall this. It's too much. But I'm a dummy. I think it ought to be told.
Good afternoon, Savannah. Well, I'm Lynn Vincent, and this is my co-author and bestie, Sara Vladic. We want to start by thanking the Savannah Festival. It has been an amazing experience. We want to thank in particular Bo, Kim, Tara, and Erica, and also Ed Conant, who just introduced us. If you are not partying with Ed and his wife Joyce, you are missing the boat. They are awesome. Also, I just wanted to mention that I was brought up not too far from here over in Alabama. And I know you have the dogs up north and you have Clemson. My son is a big Clemson fan, but is it okay to say Roll Tide in here? Sorry. We did lose the national championship, but still.
Well, I just want to echo the thanks to everyone that made it possible to bring us here and just tell you how grateful we are to share this story with you all in Savannah. And speaking of which, I kind of like to start this out by asking this question, and I'm hoping I can see enough of your hands to make it go well, but who here has heard of the USS Indianapolis before today? Wow, quite a few of you. Okay. Who heard about it from the movie Jaws? That's the usual answer. I mean, that's usually where people hear it from first. Who heard about it more recently with the finding of the ship, PBS special, or Paul Allen, his crew discovering the ship? Okay, a few. So I heard about this story when I was 13, and it was on a documentary about World War II. It was the very end, and it was the ship that carried the bomb and was sunk. And I thought, wait, there has to be more to the story than that. But there was nothing. And I was that kid that went to the library and tried to look it up. Couldn't find much of anything. There had been books, but they weren't available in my library. And so I thought, well, someday someone's going to tell this story. I didn't know at the time that would be me in some capacity, but I thought, oh, someone should tell this as a movie. So when I graduated from college, I went to Pepperdine, and I reached out to the survivors. By then, Ask Jeeves existed. There was no Google yet. I asked Jeeves to find the survivors for me, and he connected me to Paul and Mary Lou Murphy, who were the chairman and secretary of the Survivors Organization. And they said, hey, why don't you come to a reunion? That was 2001, and I just graduated college. I was so excited. I was like, yeah, I'm gonna come. And absolutely fell in love with these men who were my heroes. They were humble, they were wonderful, they were salty as you can imagine. And they just got a kick out of this 21-year-old who thought their story was phenomenal. And so a couple years passed, and they actually asked me to be their storyteller. And at that time, I wanted to do it as a movie. So I had started interviewing them, and over the course of several years, interviewed 108 survivors and made a documentary. And then wrote a screenplay. And we took the screenplay to a major network, and they said, this is the best thing we've seen since Band of Brothers, but it needs to be based on a book. And I was like, crap, I don't, am I allowed to say that? I said, I write screenplays for a living. I don't know how to write a book. And there I was, having to figure out how to write a book.
Well, as Ed mentioned, I had written a couple of books by then, and you know, as a Christian, I pray a lot about my work, and I really believe that God uses storytelling as a medium to communicate with people, and I believe that He really influences my work. And so I had already written, I can't remember how many books, but I had written military books. I had used my military experience to bring that into narrative. I really like exploring the psyche and what drives the particular American soldier, sailor, airman, Marine. And so I had been praying, and I had asked God to bring me an iconic World War II story. And those are the words I used. Lord, bring me an iconic World War II story. So then, all of a sudden, one day I get an email in 2012 from this young television producer. And it was amazing to me because, you know, there are World War II stories that are as iconic as Indianapolis, but there are none that are more iconic than Indianapolis. So I was like, oh, great, my prayer is answered. But then I had a problem because Sara called and all she wanted was advice. So I was like, how can I manipulate this young lady into letting me help her with this book? But, you know, I really did think that. But on the other hand, I really didn't also want her, you know, she just wanted advice, and I didn't want her to think that I was trying to force my way into her project.
And the more, you know, we had talked on the phone a few times, and I had asked her for advice, and the more I talked to her, I realized I really like this lady, and I wonder how I can get her to work with me. And, you know, I had a couple hesitations, though. I was very, very protective of this story and had been promising the survivors for years that if I was going to do it, I was going to do it right. And so, you know, we finally decided to meet. Lynn and I, we'd been on the phone. We both live in San Diego, but it's a big place. We're an hour apart in the same city. And so, you know, we're going to meet for lunch. And I had known at this time she had written Heaven is for Real, same kind of different as me. And I thought, oh man, she's going to show up in a sweater set carrying a Bible. And what am I going to do with that? And she showed up on a Harley, and I was like,
oh yeah.
I said, this is gonna go wonderfully. and so it did. And, you know, we started talking more and more, and I think we both baby stepped I just didn't want to be a big doofus asking this incredible best-selling author, can you come help me? You know, and I didn't know if she at the same time was hoping for me to ask her to come help. And so there we were. We finally got to that point at the same time, and I think it just worked out wonderfully.
Yeah, we became terrific writing partners, terrific research partners, and also terrific friends. And one of the great things about this project is that it enabled us to eat our way across the country. And we have had the best time in Savannah. Oh my gosh. Everyone said Savannah's food is wonderful, and they were right. So, you know, we got together, you know, what were our goals? As I think Ed mentioned, there had been several other books written about USS Indianapolis, and even some of my friends were like, why do you want to write another book about Indianapolis? Well, one reason is that through the decades, the story had really been kind of watered down to a sinking story or a shark story. And the truth is that Indianapolis was the flagship of the U.S. Pacific Fleet. How many of you have heard of Admiral Raymond Spruance? He was the leader of the Pacific Fleet, and it was from the decks of USS Indianapolis that almost the entire Pacific War was orchestrated and fought, because she was the flagship. And so we really wanted to elevate Indianapolis back to her rightful place in history, and also elevate the crew and the officers to their rightful places in history.
And the story was a very serious history, but we didn't want to write it like a history book. We wanted you to know and care about and understand these men like we did. You know, I had at this point spent more than 10 years with them. They were like grandparents to me. And I wanted you to know them in that same way. So we put you in their shoes. You know, we really wanted you to understand they're 16, 17, and 18-year-olds going to war, and the biggest thing they'd ever seen prior to this was a tractor. And so, you know, now they're on a 610-foot long ship running the show as teenagers. Imagine that today. I don't know. And so, you know, these young men, and, you know, the old salts were in their late 20s and early 30s. And so these men served aboard the ship, but we took you into their stories. You know, they had letters they had written home at the time during the war, and, you know, correspondence back and forth with their spouses or their mothers. We had diaries that they kept illegally. You know, they were told not to write anything down about their missions or what they were doing. Well, some of them did anyway, teenagers. Mm-hmm. And we had the privilege of having access to those. And so those are all the stories that we're able to incorporate. Even for those who were lost at sea, the family had kept some of those journals and those letters, and that gave a voice to men who had been lost for 70 years. And so it was so important to personalize this and really make you feel like you were there with them going through Okinawa, Iwo Jima, and then the tragedy of the sinking. And so it's a personal account just as much as it is an important history story.
And we wanted to weave those personal accounts into serious history, serious naval history, serious American history, serious World War II history. And so we did a ton of documentary research, but we didn't want the story to read like a history book. So we tried to weave that in with those personal stories. To get that serious history, we did a lot of traveling, a lot of eating in various places around the country, National Archives, Naval War College, U.S. Naval Institute, the Naval Academy. We actually traveled to USS Salem, which is docked in Quincy Harbor near Boston, because that's the last World War II era heavy cruiser still afloat, and they're restoring it and turning it into a museum. So we wanted to be able to accurately describe the inside of the ship and what that would be like. Because of that documentary research, combined with the emotional power of what the men told Sara and told me, and through the letters and memoirs and diaries, we were able to take you right into the battle. And the first place we take you in the first few pages of the book is to the bridge of Indianapolis, just as a kamikaze plane is headed in. The ship is anchored off Okinawa. They are about to participate in shore bombardment, preparatory for the invasion. And here comes this kamikaze plane. The guns start going off, the 20-millimeter guns, the 5-inch guns, and they eventually shoot the plane down, but in its descent, it crashes the deck of Indianapolis, and 9 men are killed. And how many were injured?
27.
27 were injured. And so this is just on the eve of the Battle of Okinawa, and now Admiral Spruance has to shift his flag to the USS New Mexico, and Indianapolis is sent back to the States for repairs because she was too badly damaged to continue the fight. So by this time, many of you who are familiar with the battles of World War II will know that Okinawa was the last stepping stone en route to the mainland invasion of Japan. And so when Indianapolis is sent back to the States, to San Francisco, Mare Island, for repairs, the entire crew thought that she would never have to go to war again. What they didn't know was that there was an ultra-secret project that was taking place preparatory to ending the war, and that was the Manhattan Project. And General Leslie Groves chose Indianapolis to transport the components of the atomic bomb to Tinian Island, and that would be the first bomb that was nicknamed Little Boy that would later be dropped on Hiroshima. This mission was to be carried out by the head of Manhattan Project Intelligence, whose name was Major Robert Furman. He was an Army major. And so through a lot of cloak and dagger, Major Robert Furman winds up at Hunters Point in California with the components of the atomic bomb. He has a partner, Captain James Nolan, who is a medical officer, and his job was to monitor the components of the atomic bomb for radiation. Major Furman wrote in his private papers that he wasn't really looking forward to spending time in close proximity to this uranium core of what would become Little Boy. So on July 16th, 1945, the men who thought that they were finished with war get back on their ship under very secretive circumstances. The components of the atomic bomb are brought in 2 canisters that look like, Major Furman said they look like old-fashioned ice cream freezers. So those 2 canisters contained the uranium core. There was also a large crate that was loaded onto the hangar deck. And once all of those preparations were made, off they went, left Farallon Light off San Francisco, and made a speed run all the way to Diamond Head and Pearl Harbor in Hawaii, making the journey in record time, just over 70 hours. And that's a record that still stands today for this class of ship.
And on that same day, July 16th, where Indianapolis left California, 2 Japanese submarines in the Taman Group departed from Japan and headed south. They were headed to the Philippine Sea with orders to attack anything they could attack. You know, up until this point, there was a young commander named Mochitsura Hashimoto. He was 36 years old, and he had some moderate success. He had been there since Pearl Harbor and had taken out some ships, but he really wanted to secure a major victory for Japan, for the emperor. And knowing this, he's heading down to a very, very trafficked route that went from Guam to the Philippines, east-west route, and was looking for anything he could attack. Meanwhile, in Pearl Harbor, McVeigh was now headed to Tinian. He was going to deliver the components of the atomic bomb. He had orders to deliver the secret cargo that not even he knew about. He knew nothing about this mission. Nobody on the ship except for Nolan and Furman knew about these contents. But let me tell you, when a bunch of teenagers get together and there's something they're not supposed to know, what do? They gamble and they gossip and they say they take wagers on the contents. Anyone want to guess what they thought was in it? They thought it was Rita Hayworth's underwear. Or scented toilet paper for Douglas MacArthur. Needless to say, they were not right. And so these rumors are flying, they're headed to Tinian, and their mission is to deliver this cargo, no matter what it is. And the safety of this cargo is to come before their very own vessel.
So when they get to Tinian Island, they are met by so many officers in brass hats in all of these boats streaming out to Indianapolis, and the shore is rippling with military police, and the sailors are still wondering, what in the world is this? It must be awfully important. They successfully drop the cargo, and then they head south to Guam. And now the next thing that's going to happen is Captain Charles B. McVeigh III, the commander, is now going to take his ship on a routine patrol, and not particularly classified, not a patrol, rather just a journey from Guam, 1,200 miles due west across the Philippine Sea to Leyte, Philippines. And he was really looking forward to this journey because about a third to half of the sailors and officers on board the ship were brand new and had no training, because the service academies and the boot camps were still turning out sailors and officers, even though everyone knew that it seemed like the war was drawing to an end. And the reason for that is because this homeland invasion of Japan was going to be huge. The casualty estimates were going to be somewhere around 1 million. And so Captain McVeigh had all of these new sailors and officers, and because of that emergency steam to deliver the components of the atomic bomb, he hadn't had time to train this new crew. So he was really looking forward to getting to the Philippines and getting this refresher training. So he gets his brief at Guam. And what you have to know is that because the entire focus of the war was now focused on the home islands of Japan, everyone considered the Philippine Sea kind of a backwater of the war. And so because of that, they were, frankly, a little bit complacent. And normally under these circumstances, a heavy cruiser would sail with an escort, a destroyer or a destroyer escort, and the job of that destroyer or destroyer escort was to watch out for submarines. But because everyone considered the Philippine Sea safe, they didn't provide an escort for Captain McVeigh. Also, when Indianapolis left port, there was a problem with the departure message. So the people who were supposed to know that Indianapolis was coming actually did not know she was coming. And finally, this intelligence report that Sara mentioned, that these submarines were headed south into the Philippine Sea, was classified top secret ultra. There was a recent movie about the Enigma project and this highly classified material. This material was supposed to trickle out to the fleet commanders and the forces afloat by being sanitized. But no one told Captain McVeigh that there were 2 Japanese submarines headed his way.
And then just after midnight, July 30th, 1945, Hashimoto rises to the surface. This is right before midnight, he spots the Indianapolis. It's intermittent clouds, so the moon came out at the perfect time, the light shone down on the ship, and he knew he had her. And he fires 6 torpedoes. The first torpedo hits at the 12th frame. This is about the first is it 40 feet of the bow?
66.
66 feet of the bow. And this rips the bow off the ship. It now becomes a funnel because it has this wide opening. The second torpedo hits right below, well, right where the ammunition stores are, causing a huge explosion, taking the power out, killing a good portion of the crew. The Marines who were sleeping in those quarters, the officers' country, the stewards, and sick bay were all in the area where the torpedoes hit. Now, remember, this is just after midnight, so the shift had just changed, men had laid down to go to sleep, and the torpedo hits. They don't know what happens. And the bow is gone, there's no power on the ship, they can't communicate with anyone, they can't communicate to say, go to battle stations, they can't communicate to say, stop engines. You know, protocol is to get out of there. If you've been attacked, you want to get away as fast as you can. Well, no one could tell. So the engine room thinks, we gotta go, we gotta keep this ship moving. Well, the bow is gone. It's now funneling water as it moves forward and going through all these bulkheads, breaking through, flooding the compartments of the ship. And men are doing everything they can to get topside to get to their battle stations. As the ship is doing this, it's going forward and it's starting to list. And pretty soon it's at a 45-degree angle and men are sliding down the deck. There's fires underneath, men have been badly burned. People are trying to put out those fires. And there's these incredible heroes in the radio room that despite every odd and every information that they've been passed, stay there and continue to type out SOS, knowing they probably don't have the power to get it out, but they see the needle moving, so there's hope, and they stay there, and they ultimately go down with the ship trying to get a signal out. Well, as the final moments come, and those who are trapped below can't get out, and those who are starting to get to the railing and crowd to the railing and do what they can to get off the ship, you know, they have the power's out, it's going like this, and this 610-foot-long ship is standing up on its nose and then just starts to drop. And men are coming off the ship till the last minute. And one of the survivors says it's like ants on a stick. They're crawling, they're trying to do anything they can to survive. And those who try to jump off, you know, men had started abandoning ship as soon as the torpedoes hit. And the ship traveled about a mile. So people were abandoning ship and spread out over a mile throughout this time. But those last moments, people are trying to get off the ship, And they watch as their home, some for as many as 6 to 7 years, just watch it slip below the surface with bubbling waters. And that's the end of their home. And they're left out in the middle of the Pacific, hundreds of miles from the closest land, pitch black night, in 12 minutes.
We've been talking longer than 12 minutes. That's how fast the ship sank. And as Sara said, hundreds of miles, over almost 300 miles from the nearest land. You couldn't, if you had tried to get sunk in the dead center of the Philippine Sea, you couldn't have done a better job than Hashimoto did sinking Indianapolis. So, as Sara said, the men were spread out over about a mile, and over the course of the next 5 nights and 4 days, they would become more and more spread out because of the currents. It's estimated that about 300 men went down with the ship or were killed outright when the torpedoes hit. It's estimated that somewhere between 850 and 900 men went into the water alive. Now, in a lot of shipwreck movies, you will see people with life rafts. Well, out of all of those almost 900 men, only about 30 men had life rafts. Many, many, many of the rest of the men had life jackets, and they began to coalesce in groups. The largest group was about 400 men, and they formed themselves into a circle and tried to link their life jackets together. Some men didn't have anything at all. In those first 24 hours, a lot of the men, well, we're estimating based on the size of the groups, but we think somewhere between 50 and 100 men died the first night. Some men were optimistic, though, because they knew that a distress signal had been sent. What they didn't know was that no one had received it. But they said, hey, we're supposed to be in the Philippines on Tuesday. Surely there was a departure message sent. But you remember I said that there was a problem with the departure message. So the people who were expecting Indianapolis didn't even know she was supposed to come.
But someone else did come, or something else did come. Most of you have heard the Indianapolis story, know it's famous for the sharks. And that was a very real thing that these men encountered. You know, not tens of sharks, not dozens, hundreds. And what was so eerie about it to me, I mean, I grew up as a surfer, and we'd see a shark, and everyone would go to shore as fast as you could. Hundreds of sharks. And this water is so incredibly clear, you could see 50 feet down, and you could see them swimming. And they would go right between the guy's legs. And they said there were so many of them, they could stand on their backs. And I don't know about you all, but I just died thinking about this, my heart. And these men, and they don't know who the sharks are going to attack. And there's, a story of a young man named L.D. Cox, and he was swimming right next to his buddy, and the shark came up and just grabbed his buddy. And the wave of the water, he was so close, went over his head. There's other stories. There was a group of men on a floater net, and there was about 15 to 20 men on the floater net, and all of a sudden the sharks attacked, and there was nothing left. And they said in minutes, everything was gone, including the net. And so these men, for days, are fighting off these sharks, punching them. And they said, it wasn't the big sharks, the ones that you would think would be the scariest. Those were very docile, and they would swim around very slowly and watch, and then attack. But the little ones would come very quickly and very aggressively. And, spending these years with these men, hearing their stories, they're terrifying. But the thing that I heard over and over and over throughout the years is, by far, the worst thing about the sharks was there would be silence, and then you would hear blood-curdling screams. And you wouldn't know if it was coming for you, when it was happening, you wouldn't know how. You would just hear the screams, and then it would be silent. And that scares the hell out of me. I don't surf anymore.
I don't swim in the ocean anymore. Sarah mentioned L.D. Cox. That was just the first full day in the water. L.D. Cox told us that, or told Sarah actually, because I never had the privilege of meeting L.D., but that still even the second day they thought they were going to be rescued. And then the second day went by and they were still in the water, and men were dying all around them, not only of shark attacks, but also of exposure. There was one Marine named Miles Spooner, and when he dove into the water, there was a lot of fuel oil in the water, and a lot of the men were just covered in it, this thick, viscous oil that made their faces black. Well, he dove in with his eyes open, and the oil was all over his eyes, and his eyes began to swell up so that they literally bulged out of the sockets, and he couldn't close his eyes. And so during the day, there was all this sun sparking on his eyes, and then the waves would splash salt on his eyes. And so this is the kind of exposure that the men had. They also faced, day 2 went by, as LD said, and went into day 3. They also faced dehydration. And I don't know if we have any doctors or medical people in the audience, but dehydration is a terrible way to go, because when your body fails to get enough water to dilute the salt in your system, then liquid rushes out from your cells to do the job. And so this was happening with brain cells as well. So the men their brains would start to short circuit, and they would vomit and foam at the mouth, and they would go insane. And some of them began attacking their buddies because they're hallucinating. Everyone's covered in fuel oil, so they would think that their buddy next to them was a Japanese attacker. And so they began fighting among themselves. The night of Wednesday, the ship sank at midnight, or just a few minutes after midnight on a Monday. By Wednesday night, all hell had broken loose, and men were attacking each other. They were also hallucinating less violent things. They would think that some man would say, "Oh, look, Indy didn't sink after all. She's right underneath the surface, and there's ice cream in the galley. Let's swim down there and get ice cream." Or they would see a hotel suspended on the horizon, and they would swim off to a hotel, never to be seen again. And then some of them, and they would have these group hallucinations. One of these group hallucinations was that there was an A&W root beer stand just over the wave crests, and you could get root beer from beautiful pinup girls if you just swam over there. And so it's amazing the way the human mind copes.
And that question comes up quite a bit for the survivors and us as well, is what did they think about? You know, they were in the water for 106 hours, I believe, and what did they think about? And, you know, some of them have sobering stories, and then some of them have funny ones. I mean, Al Salea, who was this 17-year-old Hispanic kid, he was a punk, and he liked to pick fights, and, you know, feisty guy, still feisty guy. And, sorry, spoiler alert, but he had a girlfriend at home, and everyone thought, oh, did you think of your lady friend? He said, no, I had a horse, and I thought of my horse, and I wanted to ride my horse. And Buck Gibson from, I don't know where, small town in Texas, he said he thought about fried chicken and his basketball and football coach. And, you know, Dick Thielen, he thought about his father. When he left, his father, you know, told him he better come home. And so every time he wanted to give up, he thought of his dad and made that promise and said, I'm not giving up, Dad. And that was very important. So these were the kind of things that these men thought about to get them through.
So by now, 5 nights have gone by, and the men are on their 4th full day in the water. And it's estimated that there are only around 400 men left living at this time, and they're dying very rapidly now. And then a miracle happens. There is a patrol plane, and the name of the pilot is Lieutenant Chuck Gwynn. And they are out on a routine submarine patrol. And he's in a PB-1 Ventura, which is the patrol car, race car of the fleet. And they are testing a new trailing antenna wire, and it keeps breaking. And so they are out over the Philippine Sea at altitude, and at this altitude, a pilot can see 400 square miles at a glance. A human head at this altitude would be as visible as the cross-section of a human hair seen from across a room. In other words, invisible. They're flying, and the trailing antenna wire is busted again. And so they do some rigmarole to try to fix it, and that involves opening a window in the deck. And so Gwynn looks down through the window, and just as quickly, he jumps back up again. And he says, his crew chief says, what's the matter? What's going on? And Gwynn says, look down and you'll see. And so they turn around, and the crew chief looks down, and he sees an oil slick in the water. Remember, I said there was all that fuel oil. You would not have been able to see human heads in the water, but they were able to see this fuel oil, and do you know what they thought it was? I bet Ed knows. They thought it was an enemy submarine. So Gwynn says, prepare for a bombing run, open the bomb bay doors, we're gonna bomb the enemy. And so they descend, and they're getting ready to drop bombs right on top of the men of Indianapolis. But at the last minute, Gwynn notices these strange lumps in the oil, and he's like, what in the world are those? And so he says, secure from bomb run, like a good commander. And they go lower, and they see the last thing in the world that they expected to see. And they can clearly see men in the water splashing and crying and praying and waving. And so at that moment, Gwynn transmits ducks on the pond, which is the signal for the men in the water. And so this transmission goes out to Leyte, and it goes down to the island of Palau, which is at the very bottom of the Philippine Sea. And one of the pilots that responds is a man named Adrian Marks, Lieutenant Adrian Marks. Do we have any lawyers in the audience? Yeah, Adrian Marks was a lawyer from Indiana. In World War II, a lot of men had established careers before they joined up to fight the war. So Adrian Marks flies his Catalina Dumbo plane up to the sinking site, and he thinks he's just going to be rescuing maybe some downed pilots, because that's what Dumbos do. They rescue downed air crews. So he flies all the way up there, and when he sees hundreds of men in the water, he can't even believe it. And so he circles, and he and Gwen drop all of their rescue equipment. They drop off life rafts, they drop out water casks, they drop out sauna buoys, hoping that the men will know how to use those to communicate. And this is routine for him. This is his job. He knows how to rescue men in the water. But there comes a moment that he realizes that the routine will not be enough, because even as they're dropping out the rescue gear, his crew sees men still being taken by sharks. And so he makes a rebel decision. Adrian Marks decides to land his Dumbo in the water. Now, a Dumbo is made to land in the water, but it's not made to land in 12-foot swells. And to do so was both dangerous and forbidden. But Adrian Marks was not a man to take no for an answer. And so he knew that no rescue ships would be in the area for at least 12 hours. So he decides, to heck with the rules, I am going to save these men. I'm in a position to do it, and I'm going to do it. And so his crew straps themselves in tight into the back of the plane because, you know, they really might not make it through this operation. And Marks grabs the control column of his plane, and he executes a power stall and slams the belly of the plane into a wave. And the ocean rejects the plane and bats it back up 15 feet into the air. And so just willing the plane to obey, Marks lands the plane on the swell again, and blue water sprays up over the windshield and slides away again, and finally the plane is in the water. And because of Adrian Marks, 53 men are immediately rescued. Do you want to talk about the rescue ships a little bit?
Sure.
Yeah.
So Adrian Marks had put men on the wings, in the cockpit, everywhere he could, because he knew, like Lynn had mentioned, the ships couldn't get there before. It would take at least 12 hours. So he pulled as many as he could out. And then the ships, you know, it's after midnight, it's pitch black again, and rescue arrives. And so there had been 2 ships that arrived basically at the same time, the Cecil J. Doyle and the USS Bassett. And there is a long story. We could do an entire speech on the rescue. There was a mutiny. There was a lot of things that took place, but the biggest thing to note is that when they arrived, they didn't know these were Americans yet. They didn't know who it was. There were no reports of a sinking vessel, so it could be the enemy. It could be a trap. And so when they arrived, they were very nervous, but what Captain Claytor did, William Claytor, he actually knew that they weren't going to be there for a very long time, and he put his light, is it 18-inch? Spotlight, straight up into the sky, saying, "We're coming," and giving these men hope. And so many men credited him with that for keeping them alive, grasping onto that, knowing rescue was coming. And that was very dangerous to do at that time in those waters. You know, enemies were clearly there. They didn't know where they were, but they knew they were there. Obviously, there had been a ship sunk. So they risked that, shined that light up into the sky, and gave the men hope.
And there was the USS Bassett. So one of the funny things that happened is, you know, the men are covered in fuel oil, and there's no word of who this sunken vessel is, so it could be Japanese. And Bassett sends out 2 LCVPs, small boats, out to this mass of men that are floating in the water. And Ensign Peter Wren, who was the one that said, "I'm a dummy, I think it should be told," he was a very young man, and he motors up to this group of men that are covered in oil, and he pulls out a .45 pistol, and he says, "Who are you, and what ship are you from?" And some salty dog in the water says, "Just like a dumbass officer asking dumbass questions." Now, Bo, I don't know how much time. 5 minutes until questions? Okay, thank you.
Okay, so we'll say this quick, but the funny thing then was he said, "Then we knew they were Americans." And so these men are rescued. They're taken back to the hospitals. They all are eventually brought to the same hospital in Guam where they recover. And then on August 6th, they receive news a bomb has been dropped on Hiroshima. And they were the ones who were responsible for taking that core in order for that bomb to be delivered, and they helped end the war. And then 3 days later, the second bomb is dropped, and soon after, Japan surrenders. But what is interesting is that during this whole time, they were not allowed to write home and tell what they had been through. They had to write home and pretend that they were still aboard the ship. So we have these letters that say, you know, darling, I'm ship business as usual, scrubbing the decks today. Meanwhile, he's in the hospital recovering with from shark bites. So this is all going on. They're not allowed to talk about it, and the Navy is now mounting an investigation.
Well, if you've ever served in the military, you know that accountability is important, but sometimes the military likes to fix blame at the lowest level. And I'm going to wrap this up quickly because I know we want to get to your questions, but essentially, after a brief investigation, the Navy decided to blame Captain McVeigh. This, even though he was not afforded a rescue ship, even though he was not given the intelligence that the Taimon group was headed south into the Philippine Sea, even though he was not notified there was another anti-submarine chase in his direct path, completely separate than the submarine that sank him. And so in December of 1945, Captain Charles McVeigh was convicted of failing to zigzag. And zigzagging was an anti-submarine tactic that even Commander Hashimoto, who sank him and who was called to testify against McVeigh in the court-martial, said it wouldn't have mattered. It wouldn't have mattered if Captain McVeigh had been zigzagging. Hashimoto said, I would have sunk him anyway. But during the court-martial, the translator didn't translate that exactly right. And so the court convicted McVeigh anyway. And that made it very public. It sent the message out to the public that the whole thing was McVeigh's fault. And all of these hundreds of families who had lost fathers and husbands and brothers and uncles had laid their, not all of them did this, but many of them laid their grief at McVeigh's feet. And so over the years, they would send him letters, these evil, vicious letters that said things like, if it weren't for you, I'd be celebrating Christmas with my son this year. If it weren't for you, my daughters would have a father. And these letters came on the anniversary of the sinking, on birthdays, on holidays, and they continued for many years afterwards. And then finally it became too much for McVeigh, and in 1968, he committed suicide.
He was the final tragedy, or the final loss of Indianapolis. And, you know, the men really, after they found out what happened, they went to bat for him. They said, there's no way our captain should be to blame. There's no way our ship should have this tarnished on its reputation. And so for 50 years, they fought for their captain. And with the help of a young boy, a 12-year-old boy from Pensacola, Florida, and the namesake submarine commander, Captain William Toady of the Indianapolis submarine, along with Senator Warner and Bob Smith, well, you should read the book and find out what happens. That's it.
Ladies, thanks for sharing that incredibly important story. And I'm going to start off, though. I heard a story that McVeigh's son was actually critical in the whole processing of getting him exonerated during the process. But the important part of that story to me was that when this actual event happened, he was 5 years old, and it took 50 years. So that's what that family carried for 50 years.
Yes.
Yeah.
For 50 years.
Yep. Well, let's have some questions. Raise your hands. There are mics around. Here's one over here. Wait for the mic, please.
In the movie, Quint gets the date wrong by a month. Did Spielberg ever learn that, do you know, and then decide not to change it?
Well, I know that Spielberg only learned about the story from his writer, Robert Sheckham, who told him this and then implemented that. And the scene was so well done. They did it in one take that they just kept it. And there are a few things they got wrong with the facts, but the sentiment is so spot on of how Robert Shaw delivered that monologue that they felt it was important to keep it.
Understand, thank you.
Okay, anybody else raise your hand? There's one in the very back. Needs a mic.
Thank you. There's a picture in the middle of the book of the surrender of the Japanese. And there's a very tall man in the picture. I don't know if you know what I'm talking about. His name is Harlington Wood, and he was an assistant to General Kelly. And the reason he was there, his wife is a good friend of mine, and she's here on Hilton Head with me, but she didn't come today. She didn't have a ticket. But I'm going to buy a book for her and have you sign it. But she told me that the reason Harlington was there was because he was 6 feet 6 inches tall. And they asked him to come to that surrender signing so that he could intimidate the shorter Japanese people. So I just wanted you to know that.
Thank you.
Okay, is anybody up in the balcony? Yes, there's one up in the balcony. Thank you.
Thank you. Congratulations on an amazing book. I just finished it. And what struck me is you talked about the psychology, the religious faith of the people that really helped them get through, and that there were no atheists in the water. Would you like to comment about some of the things they said in later life? Do they still feel that that was critical in helping them survive?
Do you want to take it? Go ahead. Absolutely. There's a gentleman who, in the video you saw, who said that Lieutenant Gwynn made a dive and talking about the rescue landing. And actually in talking to 108 of the survivors, I can only tell you that 2 ever argued consistently with me about or debated on whether it was God or something else. What really came across was the men didn't understand. It wasn't that they deserved to survive. Most of them didn't believe that they deserved to survive, that their life, they knew because they had to live a good life. And they said, what I earned in the water was a chance to do something good for God. And that has come up hundreds of times, absolutely. So it wasn't that others didn't believe and they didn't survive. It was that they were given a chance to live on behalf of them and do something good with their lives.
You have one there? Yep.
You've done such a nice job today. You deserve to ask the audience how many have read your book.
He asked, how many of you read the book? Yay!
Next, we have another one upstairs, way up in the top.
Yes. Can you hear me?
Yes.
I was wondering, are there any survivors alive today?
Yes, when Sara began the project, there were 117 living survivors. And when I joined, there were, I think, 36 is what we've come up with. Today, there are only 13 living survivors of Indianapolis. And one just died last week. And the youngest is 92 years young. And actually, we're going to be at the Tucson Book Festival here in about 10 days. And Al Saleh, the one who thought about his horse in the water, he's going to be with us.
Okay.
Can you comment on how the translation process got so goofed up?
Well, there were 2 translators. One was Francis Royal Eastlake, and he translated for a portion, and then a Captain Bromley, who was more familiar with tactical and strategic naval operations. He was the actual translator during the court-martial itself when Commander Hashimoto was testifying. I'm not sure how the translation got so messed up, but we do know because we interviewed Atsuko Iida, who is actually now a U.S. citizen and lives in Missouri. She was the granddaughter of Hashimoto. And Hashimoto was just heartbroken when he came back, and he told his wife and his family, including his granddaughter, basically that after Commander Bromley translated what Hashimoto said in the court-martial, Hashimoto thought to himself, that's not what I said. That's not what I said. But I don't know whether he felt too intimidated to correct it. We really don't know what happened.
Yes, I haven't read your book yet, but I did read the book by Stanton. And in his book, he indicates that the radio message that was sent from the Indianapolis, in fact, was received, but that wasn't reported for many years. Can you comment on that?
Unfortunately, that, we believe, was a bunch of young men who had perhaps wanted to do something and didn't, and came up with a story. What we did spend a significant amount of time going through all the log books of the ships, of the tugs, of all the things that could possibly have been involved with those commands where it was reported that the SOS had come in. And there were no pages missing. There was nothing scratched out. There was absolutely nothing there to indicate that an SOS had come in, nor had they sent out a convoy to see if something was there. So what we believe really happened was an instant of, yeah, I heard that come in, but I didn't report it. Those kind of things, and rumors that kind of circulated, but there was nothing that we could corroborate with that. And we even worked with the Navy in several groups to try to pinpoint that, and again, nothing. And the way that the Navy explained it is we're just not that organized to cover up something that well.
Okay, upstairs again.
So you talked about the survivors feeling they needed to lead a good life. My dad was supposed to have been deployed on the Indianapolis, but at the last minute, his orders were changed. He suffered from what we now know as PTSD, but also from survivor's remorse. So did you ever talk to any of the survivors about that aspect of it?
Absolutely. In fact, not only survivors, but former crew that had also gotten off the ship at Guam right before the final sailing suffered tremendously because those were their shipmates, and they knew all of them, had served on those ships the ship for years, and everyone died, and why did they get to survive? And they almost suffered just as greatly as those who witnessed it. And men dealt with that with alcoholism, with we see it today with veterans that come back, PTSD. They suffered it. They didn't have the diagnosis of PTSD back then in the way that we do now. They were told just to go back to work and go on with your lives. And they tried their best to do that, but some of them failed very badly at life, had failed marriages, committed suicide. And so it really deeply affected all of them. The men that went in the water were not the men who came home.
Okay, we have time for one more.
Sara, I find it quite ironical that you stuck with this from 13 through college and kept pursuing it. And I'm wondering what kept the fires burning in your heart.
Well, when you have 117 grandpas calling you and saying, hey, are you at the beach drinking a margarita, or are you working on our story? And truthfully, it was much bigger than that. And, I could tell you about this for hours, but it was tough. This was a hard story to tell right. I promised these men that I would do everything to tell it the way they wanted it. And there were days that I wanted to run screaming from this project. And those would be the exact days I'd get a phone call. Hey, I just want to know we're thinking of you. Are you telling our story? What can we do to help? Every time, without fail. And it was, believe it or not, God was so involved in this process that I got a kick in the butt every time I needed it, and I'm thankful for it. So it's been a privilege. For all the good and bad, it's been an incredible privilege. And, You know, when we turned the book in, we handed it off to the remaining survivors. And let me tell you about the scariest moment ever. You don't care what critics think. You don't care what anyone thinks. When you hand a life story that you were tasked with over to the people that lived it, and you're waiting for an answer, scariest thing ever. And we got back. The first thing I got back was a survivor named James Smith said, "I couldn't sleep for 2 days. I had to find out what happened." And then one of the ones I was the most scared of, that was the most critical, was the junior damage control officer by the name of John Woolston. He was very meticulous, very, very cerebral. He was an MIT grad, and I thought, oh man, we're gonna get it from him, because he did not care if he hurt your feelings. And he said, "You got it right, kid." And so we knew the whole journey was worth it.
Well, thank you very much, ladies. Once again, give them a hand.